Since I made the video on Soulsborne boss difficulty, people have bullied me in the streets to make similar videos on games like Monster Hunter or other Souls-likes. I personally want to do one on Mega Man, but I thought I'd focus on other projects instead. And then I played Silksong. I got to the infamous Citadel, the 10-round enemy rush, and I thought, golly gosh, this feels harder than Hollow Knight. A damning thought as I could feel the cold hand of the data mines on my shoulder once more. I kissed my son goodbye and fell into the void. I learned a lot from my previous videos and took to heart some of the feedback in the comments, especially suggestions to add more depth to the analysis. This time I wanted to examine difficulty across all skill levels, still focusing on blind playthroughs though. I committed to 15 runs per game. 5 from great players, 5 from average players, and 5 from casual players. In fact, I may have ended up gathering more data than I did for both of my FromSoft videos combined. Yeah. Before we dive in, a few quick notes. In Hollow Knight, several bosses are only accessible through the God Home Pantheon. These include Oroamato, Sly, Shio, Winged Nosk, Sisters of Battle, Pure Vessel, and Absolute Radiance. You can practice against these bosses as well, and I count each attempt separately until the boss is defeated for the first time per run. This research led me to track 3 additional encounters in Silksong: the Roof Splitter on the way to the Wormways, the first Scar Guard you fight, and the Citadel High Hall's Gauntlet. Let's start with Hollow Knight. It features 34 bosses in the base game, with an additional 12 introduced through DLC. Across 15 runs of the base game, players racked up 1,993 deaths to bosses, an average of 3.9 deaths per boss per run. When including the DLC, the total number of deaths jumps to 4,184, raising the average to 5.9 deaths per boss per run. That means nearly half, 52.4% to be exact, of all deaths occurred in the DLC. And each of the 12 DLC bosses averaged a staggering 12.3 deaths per run. The audience perspective on difficulty adds another layer of intrigue. DLC content is sometimes excluded from ranking, and heightened forms of bosses like Sisters of Battle for Mantis Lords aren't always listed separately. According to popular opinion, the perceived hardest bosses are Grey Prince Zote, the Radiance, Pure Vessel, Nightmare King Grim, and Absolute Radiance as the hardest boss. However, the actual data tells a slightly different story. Radiance ranks 5th, followed by Lost Kin, Pure Vessel, and Absolute Radiance, with Nightmare King Grim still reigning supreme. Most of these align really with the audience perception, though there are some notable shifts. Grey Prince Zote drops 3 spots to 8th. Lost Kin jumps up 5 spots from 9th in perception to 4th spot in the data. As for the easiest bosses, there's near universal agreement Zote the Mighty, the joke boss, is the least challenging, obviously. Excluding him, the bottom 5 by audience perception are False Knight, Soul Warrior, Gru's Mother, Vengefly King, and Massive Moss Charger as the easiest. However, the data paints a different picture. The actual easiest bosses are Winged Nosk, Elder Who, Gru's Mother, Oblobbles, and Vengefly King. Winged Nosk stands out here. Despite appearing in the middle of the Hallowness Pantheon, its movement pattern is far simpler than regular Nosks, which is why Oblobbles drops 17 spots in the data, perhaps as it comes after an enemy gauntlet in the Colosseum. Massive Moss Charger and Soul Warrior jump up 7 and 8 places respectively, mainly due to the early placement in the games and getting a couple more deaths from their ambushes. Elder Who drops into the bottom 5 as the only Dreamnail fight to do so. Fairly late in the game and an easy movement pattern seal their fate. When comparing the most and least difficult bosses across different skill levels, rankings remain largely consistent. One exception is God Tamer, who flirts with being the 5th easiest boss amongst the least skilled players. This is likely because this boss comes after a gauntlet of enemies in the Colosseum. After you've struggled through that difficult part, the boss itself isn't actually that difficult compared to the rest of the gauntlet. and so most of the deaths come from being on low health by the time you reach the God Tamer. Two bosses, however, show significant shifts based on player skill. The first is the Green Path Hornet fight, which ranks 6th most difficult for medium skilled players, but only 14th overall. This spike is due to one specific player, Tan ND, who died 41 times to Hornet, but then only 42 more times across the rest of the game. Without this anomaly, Hornet would drop to 22nd most difficult boss fight for medium skilled players. The other standout is Sisters of Battle. Less experienced players found them the 20 most difficult, overwhelmed by the third Mantis, but for more skilled players, already deep into the pantheon of Hallowness, the fight is far less daunting, as attack patterns closely mirror those of the Mantis Lords. Interestingly, while Sisters of Battle are objectively harder than Mantis Lords and rank much higher in audience perception, 6th versus 23rd, the data doesn't hide anything. Sisters of Battle come in at 24th most difficult, while Mantis Lords rank 12th most difficult, which likely reflects the timing of the encounters. Mantis Lords appear early when players are still learning the mechanics and are underpowered. Looking at other clone fights, the upgraded versions are almost always harder. Lost Kin, Enraged Guardian, Soul Tyrant, White Defender, Failed Champion, Nightmare King, Grim, Pure Vessel, and Absolute Radiance all cause more deaths. This makes sense, as these versions tend to move faster and often deal 2 masks of damage per hit. Nightmare King Grim is a prime example. The average hits per death drop from 13.55 for Troop Master Grim to just 6.14 for its Nightmare form. The only exception to this trend is Nosk. Its original form caused nearly 10 times more deaths than Winged Nosk. A few other stats stand out here. Enraged Guardian has the fewest hits per death at 4.6, thanks to its lasers dealing 2 masks of damage each. On the other end of the spectrum, Oblobbles average 23.5 hits per death, largely due to their slow, predictable patterns and the opportunity to heal mid-fight. While Markov is often cited as the hardest Dreamnail boss, that's mostly due to the Pantheon version. In reality, Markov ranks 29th in difficulty compared to 8th in audience perception. The actual toughest Dreamnail bosses by the data are Galleon with 33 deaths, Marmu with 30 deaths, and then Markoth with 27 deaths. Among high-skilled players, only 5 non-Zote bosses resulted in 0 deaths. Gru's Mother, Vengefly King, Elder Hu, Sisters of Battle, and Winged Nosk. Other notable shifts from perception to data include Paintmaster Shio, who drops 15 spots from audience perception to 36th in the data, due to a fairly easy pattern for late game. Moving on to Silksong. It features 45 bosses with no DLC released at time of recording. Across 15 runs, players recorded a total of 3,920 deaths, an average of 5.8 deaths per boss run. That's just a couple of hundred below Hollow Knight with its DLC, and nearly double the average of the Hollow Knight base game alone. So far, the overall stats suggest the two games are remarkably consistent in difficulty, contrary to the general consensus that Silksong is significantly harder. With the audience perspective on the Silksong bosses, the top 5 most difficult are Groll the Great, Last Judge, Tormented Trobio, Lost Lace, and Scar Singer Carmelita as the toughest. And yet, if you look in the data, the actual top 5 are First Sinner, Last Judge, Chakra, Scar Singer Carmelita, and Lost Lace. Groll the Great drops 5 places to 10th. Groll's drop is likely due to the miserable runback through Biowater. Echoing what we saw in the FromSoft video, runbacks can heavily skew perceived difficulty. Tormented Trobio drops 10 spots to 13th, which is possibly due to the similar style of fight to the original Trobio, but with the player being much stronger in Act 3. Scar Singer Carmelita, which ranked first in audience perception, falls 1 spot in the data, which leaves Lost Lace to move 1 spot up to claim the top rank. Both are Act 3 bosses, featuring incredibly fast-paced combat, diverse movement patterns, heavy-hitting double mask attacks, and a barrage of projectiles, making their high rankings well earned. Chakra is the surprising one here, jumping up 17 spots to claim third. It caused lots more problems than people give it credit for, possibly being underestimated due to the fact you can restart the fight very quickly and the optional nature of the duel. As for the easiest bosses, audience perception lists Skull Tyrant from Marrow, Skull Tyrant from Moss Grotto, Vault Worm, Plasmified Zango, and Moss Mother from the Moss Grotto being the easiest. And then analysing the data, we see the actual easiest bosses are Great Conch Flies, Skull Tyrant from Moss Grotto, Crawfather, Crust King Khan, and Moss Mother from Moss Grotto. Plasmified Zango, cited as the second easiest, ranks 35th in the data, likely due to its gimmick involving the file, which can trip up players unfamiliar with the mechanic. Moss Mother's placement makes sense, it's the tutorial boss and the only one in the game with 0 deaths across all runs. The Skull Tyrants are also straightforward, but the Marrow variant ranks 30th, which is 11 spots higher than expected, due to its early game placement and double mask damage, which leads to 38 deaths. Crust King Khan and Crawfather both drop significantly in the data. Khan drops from 30th to 44th, and Crawfather drops from 31st to 43rd. This is likely since their pre-fight gauntlets are more memorable than the bosses themselves. Khan only caused 2 deaths across all runs. Interestingly, 60% of the 10 easiest bosses are from Act 3, 30% from Act 1 and just 1 from Act 2. This highlights the wide difficulty variance in Act 3. While bosses like Carmelita and Lost Lace offer a true endgame challenge, others like Pale Stag, Gur the Outcast, Crawfather and Plasmified Zango are relatively simple. By the time players reach them, they're often well equipped and highly skilled enough to make these fights feel underwhelming. One major contributor to Silksong's difficulty is the prevalence of double mask damage. Early game bosses like Bell Beast, Savage Beastfly, the Scar Guard, the Marrow Skull Tyrant, and the Last Judge all average around 5 hits per death. For comparison, Hollow Knight's most punishing bosses, Failed Champion, Enraged Guardian, Hornet Protector, Nightmare King Grim, and Fluke Mom, hover closer to 6 hits per death. So you'd expect Silksong to have a lower average of hits per death, right? Well, surprisingly not. Silksong averages close to 9 hits per death, while Hollow Knight with its DLC comes in slightly lower at 8.3. And this is actually due to one specific thing. The fights in Silksong, which have a wave of enemies before you fight the boss, which means you have more chance to heal and more weaker hits. So bosses like Groll the Great, Crust King Khan, and Crawfather offer plenty of one-mask hits and healing opportunities. For context, Hollow Knight's spongiest boss was Oblobbles at 23.5 hits per death, as I said before. Crawfather nearly doubles that with a staggering 48.7 hits per death. Overall, this may come down to game feel. Healing one mask in Hollow Knight takes about 1.5 seconds, while in Silksong you can heal 3 masks at the exact same time. This speeds up combat and encourages aggression, but also makes getting hit during a heal feel more punishing. And it's likely this illusion of faster deaths and heavier hits is the specific thing that makes Silksong feel tougher even when the numbers say otherwise. A few final notes. The introductory Scar Guard ranks as the 9th most deadly boss thanks to its tight arena and early game lethality. It can kill you in roughly 3 hits. Similarly, the Gauntlet in the High Halls ranks 15th in difficulty. While not a boss either, it's one of the most notorious segments of the game and the data backs that up. I hated this part. And to wrap things up, I combined the data to highlight 3 categories. The 5 easiest bosses, excluding Zote, are the Moss Grotto Skull Tyrant, the Vengefly King, Crust King Khan, Crawfather, and the Moss Mother in Moss Grotto. Notably, 4 of these are from Silksong, and 2 of them are Act 3 bosses. That's surprising, considering Act 3 is meant to be a late game challenge. Their inclusion here suggests that Silksong's difficulty curve isn't always aligned with progression. For the hardest bosses for lower skilled players, we have Scarsinger Carmelita, Absolute Radiance, Lost Lace, Pure Vessel, and Nightmare King Grim. These 5 accounted for 1,764 deaths across 5 runs. Interestingly, 3 of them are Hollow Knight DLC bosses. If we exclude the DLC, the top contenders shift to Chakra, the Radiance and Last Judge, meaning 4 of the top 5 are also Silksong bosses. So Silksong manages to dominate both ends of the difficulty spectrum. And let's be honest, when we inevitably get that DLC for Silksong, it's probably going to be pants-shittingly hard. Finally, the hardest bosses for the high-skilled players are Lost Lace, Chakra, First Sinner, Nightmare King Grim, and a surprise leader of Lost Kin. Lost Kin's placement is also probably a bit of an anomaly as well. 2 runners, Drumality and Shady Penguin, recorded the highest number of deaths to Lost Kin, but neither actually attempted Nightmare King Grim in their runs, which skewed the data a little bit. So I had to supplement the data for Nightmare King Grim's attempts with other top tier players across all skill levels. Across all runs that attempted Grim, it consistently ranks as the toughest fight, so this is likely just a data blip. I then checked a couple more pro runs. The Nightmare King Grim deaths totaled 41, while for the same runs, the Lost Kin has 7 deaths. This then reduces the high skilled players' deaths total for Lost Kin down from 59 to 22, which would then bump up Absolute Radiance into 5th spot, making Nightmare King Grim the toughest once more. As a little case study, I compared Cross King Khan versus Nightmare King Grim. Both are endgame bosses, but they sit at opposite ends of the difficulty spectrum, and I'll break down exactly why. There are 2 reasons. The first reason is the move variety. Cross King Khan has 7 distinct attacks. Jumping, which counts as an attack, 4 different directional rock pillars, and 2 multi-rock spawning moves. Grim also has 7 core attacks, however Grim's attacks vary based on player position and often contain multiple layers. If you count individual separate attacks and projectiles, Grim's move complexity jumps to around about 25. So while both have similar base move counts, Grim's layered design makes him far more dynamic. But the most important factor is the aggression factor. Cross King Khan, in a successful run, has 96 attacks in 3 minutes and 37 seconds, which is 1 attack every 2.26 seconds. Nightmare King Grim, similarly in a successful run, has 196 attacks in 3 minutes 54 seconds, which is 1 attack every 1.19 seconds. Grim's pace is nearly double that of Khan. If Khan fought at Grim's tempo, he'd likely rank among the harder bosses, but Silksong's reliance on enemy rushes before boss fights slows the pacing, which mercifully softens the difficulty of the boss, as it was probably designed not to be as difficult. If you want to remove optional challenges, then these are the following bosses you must defeat to beat each game. For Hollow Knight, the only mandatory bosses are the first Hornet fight, the Watcher Knights, Umu, and the Hollow Knight. Technically, you can skip the Hornet fight, but I only skipped fights that were very easy to skip and don't require something crazy to complete the game. These 4 bosses total 298 deaths. For Silksong, the mandatory bosses are the Tutorial Moss Mother, Widow, either Last Judge or Phantom, Cogwork Dancers, the second Lace fight in the Cradle, and Grandmother Silk. Since Phantom has fewer deaths than Last Judge, let's choose that route. But even so, it comes to 499 deaths in total, which perhaps emphasises that Silksong's core game is harder, but the optional challenges in Hollow Knight, specifically the DLC, is where the challenge lies for that game. One last bit of analysis I did was comparing runners who ran both games and looking at their total. 3 runners I looked at here were Teal Game Master, Small Ant, and Park and Harbour. Starting with Small Ant, we have 143 deaths in Hollow Knight and then 166 deaths in Silksong, struggling most with Nightmare King Grim and Lost Lace respectively, the hardest bosses in the data. Looking at Park and Harbour, we have 565 deaths in Hollow Knight and then 291 deaths in Silksong. It may amount to the fact that they have practiced Hollow Knight far more and given themselves a much stronger muscle memory when it came to their playthrough of Silksong. Curiously, the bosses they struggled most with were the Pure Vessel and the Far Field's Savage Beastfly, neither of which are the hardest in the data. Finally, looking at Teal Game Master, we have 54 deaths in Hollow Knight and then 68 deaths in Silksong. The hardest fights for them were Nightmare King Grim and the Savage Beastfly in the Chapel of the Beast. I chose these runners on purpose as they can nicely slot into each skill category and it paints an interesting picture. For less skilled players or newcomers to the genre, Hollow Knight looks much harder, with Silksong being easier once you've gotten used to that type of game. Yet with medium and high skilled players who've probably already had it click for them, it seems that Silksong takes the edge in challenge. So, final thoughts, what did we learn? Well, when comparing the base games alone, Silksong comes out as a tougher experience, with nearly double the number of deaths compared to Hollow Knight. However, factoring in Hollow Knight's DLC, the scales tip slightly in its favour. This is most keenly felt with all three of Hollow Knight's most challenging fights being found in the DLC content, with Nightmare King Grim as the toughest boss overall. In total, Hollow Knight edges ahead with 3 more deaths than Silksong and a slightly lower hits per death ratio, meaning that the bosses are a little bit more deadly. Also, Hollow Knight has 3 out of the 5 hardest bosses across all skill levels. Based on the data, I'd argue Hollow Knight is the slightly harder game, but with 2 important caveats. First, amongst higher skilled players, Silksong showed to be harder than Hollow Knight. I do also believe the enemy rushes before bosses having more double mask damage moves, and nastier runbacks add to a perception of difficulty without being supported in the raw numbers. The second caveat is that Silksong is still fresh and almost certainly due for a DLC. If Team Cherry follows their established pattern, we can expect that expansion to be nothing short of merciless.